The committee meets today to receive testimony on the worldwide threats facing the United States and our international partners. I'd like to welcome Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines and Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Scott D. Berrier. Thank you both for joining us, and please convey the committee's gratitude to the men and women of the intelligence community for their critical work. We must start by addressing the illegal war Vladimir Putin is waging in Ukraine. Over the past 2.5 months, Russia's unprovoked aggression has inflicted horrific suffering upon innocent civilians in Ukraine, threatened European security, and caused serious consequences for the global economy. In the face of this senseless violence, the Ukrainian military has performed tremendously, supported by the United States and the international community. A formidable array of our global allies and partners have joined in solidarity to impose severe sanctions on Russia and provide support to Ukraine. We cannot overstate the scale and importance of this unity. I want to commend the Biden administration and the leaders of the intelligence community for the unprecedented and skillful release of intelligence over the last several months that exposed Russia's aggressive intentions and deceitful activities ahead of its invasion of Ukraine. Intelligence officials are understandably cautious about revealing hard-won insights on adversaries, but this strategy has proven highly effective in strengthening the international community's response and creating dilemmas for Vladimir Putin. This is a great example of competing effectively in the information domain, and I hope we will continue to make use of this kind of creative tradecraft. With that in mind, Russia's strategy in Ukraine seems to be evolving. Director Haines, General Berrier, I would ask for your assessment of the Ukraine conflict in the logic context of the evolving international order, as well as the implications for the United States' approach to security in the European theater going forward. We must also stay focused on our long-term strategic competition with China. In addition to its economic and socio-political growth, China has studied the United States' way of war and focused on offsetting our advantages. Beijing has made concerning progress in this regard and holds its own expansive geostrategic ambitions. As we speak, China is watching how the nations of the world respond to Russia. In considering a potential invasion of Taiwan, President Xi is scrutinizing Putin's playbook and the international response. However, there is a broad consensus that our comparative advantage over China is our network of partners and allies in the region and globally. Strengthening that network should be at the center of any strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, and the maturation of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, involving the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, presents a strategic opportunity to establish a durable framework. I would ask our witnesses to share what military and non-military factors are most likely to impact Chinese decision-making with respect to potential action against Taiwan. Turning to Iran, in the 4 years since then-President Trump pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, Iran has made key nuclear advances. It has decreased breakout time to several weeks from a year under the previous agreement. It has increased uranium enrichment to 60% instead of just under 4% allowed under the agreement. Iran has hardened its infrastructure and replaced damaged equipment with more advanced models. And while negotiations to return Iran to the JCPOA are in the final stages, the final outcome has not yet been determined. Beyond its nuclear advances, Iran and Iranian proxies continue to mount drone and rocket attacks in the region, including against bases in Iraq and Syria with a U.S. military presence. Saudi Arabia and also now the United Arab Emirates have also come under attack. Director Haines, given these current dynamics, I would like your thoughts on how best to de-escalate tensions with Iran while preserving space to return to the JCPOA. Finally, this year's threat assessment again highlights the challenges posed by environmental degradation from climate change. I understand it is the DNI's view that climate change will increasingly exacerbate risk to U.S. national security interests as issues like rising temperatures, poor water governance, pollution, changing precipitation patterns, and other climate effects are likely to lead to an array of human challenges such as food and water insecurity and threats to human health. We live in a complex and dangerous global security environment, from Russia's aggression in Europe to China's influence in the Indo-Pacific to countless other malign actors around the world. Prevailing in this environment will require resolute, thoughtful strategies. I look forward to our witnesses' insights into these issues, and I thank them again for their participation. Now let me turn to the ranking member, Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join you in welcoming our witnesses. When our witnesses testified before this committee last year, or we had witnesses, they provided a dire assessment of the threats to our national security. It's clear, and I really can't overstate this. The security situation we face today is significantly more dangerous and complex than it has ever been, or it certainly was a year ago. The Chinese threat is beyond anything we ever dealt with before. This year, Beijing announced a 7.1% defense budget increase. They've had 2 decades of real growth with no signs of slowing down. And as the chairman alluded to, Putin's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine shows the danger posed by the nuclear-armed Russia to our security and those of our allies and international order. Iran's malign behavior continues throughout the Middle East, and terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are growing in strength across Africa. Despite this reality, President Biden's budget request is inadequate. It doesn't deliver the real growth our military needs, and that is the 3 to 5% increase that we established some 5 years ago. And as I've said it before, inflation is the new sequestration that we consider today, and it's making everything we do more difficult. So I look forward to hearing from both of you about how our threats have evolved ever since last year, and how the intelligence community is changing to respond to the national security strategy. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. Now let me recognize Director Haines.
Thank you very much, Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Inhofe, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today and to provide testimony alongside General Berrier on the intelligence community's annual assessment of worldwide threats to U.S. national security. Before I start, I just want to take a moment to publicly thank the men and women of the intelligence community for their extraordinary work to keep us safe. I know how privileged I am to be part of this community of truly talented people, to be given a chance to do something useful in service of my country, and I thank you for support for their work. Broadly speaking, this year's assessment focuses, much like last year's assessment, on adversaries and competitors, critical transnational threats, and conflicts and instability. And these categories often overlap. Cybercrime, for example, is a transnational threat while also being a threat that emanates from state actors. One of the key challenges of this era is assessing how various threats and trends are likely to intersect so as to identify where their interactions may result in fundamentally greater risk to our interests than one might otherwise expect, or where they introduce new opportunities. And this year's annual threat assessment highlights some of these connections as it provides the IC's baseline of the most pressing threats to U.S. national security. The assessment starts with threats from key state actors, beginning with the People's Republic of China, which remains an unparalleled priority for the intelligence community, and then turns to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. All 4 governments have demonstrated the capability and intent to promote their interests in ways that cut against U.S. and allied interests. The PRC is coming ever closer to being a peer competitor in areas of relevance to national security, is pushing to revise global norms and institutions to its advantage, and is challenging the United States in multiple arenas, economically, militarily, and technologically. China is especially effective at bringing together a coordinated whole-of-government approach to demonstrate its strength and to compel neighbors to acquiesce to its preferences, including its territorial and maritime claims and assertions of sovereignty over Taiwan. And a key area of focus for the IC is President Xi Jinping's determination to force unification with Taiwan on Beijing's terms. China would prefer coerced unification that avoids armed conflict, and it has been stepping up diplomatic, economic, and military pressure on the island for years to isolate it and weaken confidence in its democratically elected leaders. And at the same time, Beijing is prepared to use military force if it decides this is necessary. The PRC is also engaged in the largest ever nuclear force expansion and arsenal diversification in its history, is working to match or exceed U.S. capabilities in space, and presents the broadest, most active, and persistent cyber espionage threat to U.S. government and private sector networks. And Russia, of course, also remains a critical priority and is a significant focus right now in light of President Putin's tragic invasion of Ukraine in February, which has produced a shock to the geopolitical order with implications for the future that we are only beginning to understand but are sure to be consequential. And the IC, as you know, provided warning of President Putin's plans, but this is a case where I think all of us wish we had been wrong. Russia's failure to rapidly seize Kyiv and overwhelm Ukrainian forces has deprived Moscow of the quick military victory that it had originally expected would prevent the United States and NATO from being able to provide meaningful military aid to Ukraine. And the Russians met with more resistance from Ukraine than they expected, and their own military's performance revealed a number of significant internal challenges, forcing them to adjust their initial military objectives, fall back from Kyiv, and focus on the Donbass. The next month or two of fighting will be significant as the Russians attempt to reinvigorate their efforts, but even if they are successful, we are not confident that the fight in the Donbass will effectively end the war. We assess President Putin is preparing for a prolonged conflict in Ukraine, during which he still intends to achieve goals beyond the Donbass. We assess that Putin's strategic goals have probably not changed, suggesting he regards the decision in late March to refocus Russian forces on the Donbass as only a temporary shift to regain the initiative after the Russian military's failure to capture Kyiv. And his current near-term military objectives are to capture the two oblasts in Donetsk and Luhansk with a buffer zone, encircle Ukrainian forces from the north and the south to the west of the Donbass, in order to crush the most capable and well-equipped Ukrainian forces who are fighting to hold the line in the east, consolidate control of the land bridge Russia has established from Crimea to the Donbass, occupy Kherson, and control the water source for Crimea, that is to the north. And we also see indications that the Russian military wants to extend the land bridge to Transnistria. And while the Russian forces may be capable of achieving most of these near-term goals in the coming months, we believe that they will not be able to extend control over a land bridge that stretches to Transnistria and includes Odessa without launching some form of mobilization. And it is increasingly unlikely that they will be able to establish control over both oblasts and the buffer zone they desire in the coming weeks. But Putin most likely also judges that Russia has a greater ability and willingness to endure challenges than his adversaries, and he is probably counting on U.S. and EU resolve to weaken as food shortages, inflation, energy prices get worse. Moreover, as both Russia and Ukraine believe they can continue to make progress militarily, we do not see a viable negotiating path forward, at least in the short term. The uncertain nature of the battle, which is developing into a war of attrition, combined with the reality that Putin faces a mismatch between his ambitions and Russia's current conventional military capabilities, likely means the next few months could see us moving along a more unpredictable and potentially escalatory trajectory. At the very least, we believe the dichotomy will usher in a period of more ad hoc decision-making in Russia, both with respect to the domestic adjustments required to sustain this push, as well as the military conflict with Ukraine and the West. And the current trend increases the likelihood that President Putin will turn to more drastic means, including imposing martial law, reorienting industrial production, or potentially escalatory military actions to free up the resources needed to achieve his objectives as the conflict drags on, or if he perceives Russia is losing in Ukraine. And the most likely flashpoints for escalation in the coming weeks are around increasing Russian attempts to interdict Western security assistance, retaliation for Western economic sanctions, or threats to the regime at home. We believe that Moscow continues to use nuclear rhetoric to deter the United States and the West from increasing lethal aid to Ukraine and to respond to public comments at the U.S. and NATO allies that suggest expanded Western goals in the conflict. And if Putin perceives that the United States is ignoring his threats, he may try to signal to Washington the heightened danger of its support to Ukraine by authorizing another large nuclear exercise involving a major dispersal of mobile intercontinental missiles, heavy bombers, strategic submarines. We otherwise continue to believe that President Putin would probably only authorize the use of nuclear weapons if he perceived an existential threat to the Russian state or regime, but we will remain vigilant in monitoring every aspect of Russia's strategic nuclear forces. With tensions this high, there is always an enhanced potential for miscalculation, unintended escalation, which we hope our intelligence can help to mitigate. Beyond its invasion of Ukraine, Moscow presents a serious cyber threat, a key space competitor, and one of the most serious foreign influence threats to the United States. Using its intelligence services, proxies, wide-ranging influence tools, the Russian government seeks to not only pursue its own interests, but also to divide Western alliances, undermine U.S. global standing, amplify discord inside the United States, and influence U.S. voters and decision-making. And to finish with our state actor threats, the Iranian regime continues to threaten U.S. interests as it tries to erode U.S. influence in the Middle East, entrench its influence and project power in neighboring states, and minimize threats to regime stability. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un continues to steadily expand and enhance Pyongyang's nuclear and conventional capabilities, targeting the United States and its allies, periodically using aggressive, potentially destabilizing actions to reshape the regional security environment in his favor and to reinforce its status quo as a de facto nuclear power. And the assessment continues to focus on a number of key global and transnational threats, including global health security, transnational organized crime, the rapid development of destabilizing technologies, climate, migration, and terrorism. I raise these because they pose challenges of a fundamentally different nature to our national security than those posed by the actions of nation states, even powerful ones like China and Russia. And we look at the Russia-Ukraine war and can imagine outcomes to resolve the crisis and the steps needed to get there, even though unpalatable and difficult. And similarly, we view the array of challenges Chinese actions pose and can discuss what is required, how we think about trade-offs. But transnational issues are more complex, require significant and sustained multilateral effort, and though we can discuss ways of managing them, all of them pose a set of choices that will be more difficult to untangle and will perhaps require more sacrifice to bring about meaningful change. This reflects not just the interconnected nature of the problems, but also the significant impact increasingly empowered non-state actors have on the outcomes and the reality that some of the countries who are key to mitigating threats posed by nation states are also the ones we will be asking to do more in the transnational space. And for example, the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic is putting a strain on governments and societies, fueling humanitarian and economic crises, political unrest, and geopolitical competition. Low-income countries with high debts face particularly challenging recoveries, now exacerbated in some cases by increasing food security resulting from the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And these shifts will spur migration around the world, including on our southern border. The economic impact has set many poor and middle-income countries back years in terms of economic development and is encouraging some in Latin America, Africa, and Asia to look to China and Russia for quick economic and security assistance to manage their new reality. And we see the same complex mix of interlocking challenges stemming from the threat of climate change, which is exacerbating risks in U.S. national security interests across the board, but particularly as it intersects with environmental degradation and global health challenges. And terrorism, of course, remains a persistent threat to U.S. persons and interests at home and abroad, but the implications of the problem are evolving. In Africa, for example, where terrorist groups are clearly gaining strength, the growing overlap between terrorism, criminal activity, and smuggling networks has undermined stability, contributed to coups and an erosion of democracy, and resulted in countries turning to Russian entities to help manage these problems. Global transnational criminal organizations continue to pose a direct threat to the United States through the production and trafficking of lethal illicit drugs, massive theft, including cybercrime, human trafficking, and financial crimes and money laundering schemes. And in particular, the threat from illicit drugs is at historic levels, with more than 100,000 Americans drug overdose deaths for the first time annually, driven mainly by a robust supply of synthetic opioids from Mexican transnational criminal organizations. In short, the interconnected global security environment is marked by the growing specter of great power competition and conflict, while transnational threats to all nations and actors compete not only for our attention, but also for finite resources. And finally, the assessment turns to conflicts and instability, highlighting a series of regional challenges of importance to the United States. Iterative violence between Israel and Iran and conflicts in other areas, including Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, have the potential to escalate or spread, fueling humanitarian crises and threatening U.S. persons. Africa, for example, has seen 6 irregular transfers of power since 2020. and probably will see new bouts of conflict in the coming year as the region becomes increasingly strained by a volatile mixture of democratic backsliding, intercommunal violence, and the continued threat of cross-border terrorism. And finally, most important of all, we are focused on our workforces and their families. The IC continues to contribute to the government-wide effort to better understand potential causal mechanisms of anomalous health incidents and remains committed to ensuring afflicted individuals receive the quality care they need. The safety and well-being of our workforce is our highest priority, and we are grateful to members of this committee for your continued support on these issues. Thank you for the opportunity to present our assessments, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Director. General Berrier, please.
Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Inhofe, and distinguished members of the committee, it is a privilege to testify today as part of the intelligence community's 2022 assessment of worldwide threats to U.S. national security. On behalf of the Defense Intelligence Agency, I want to express how much we appreciate your support and partnership. Thank you. DIA fills a unique intelligence role by providing strategic, operational, and tactical intelligence to our warfighters, defense planners, policymakers, and the acquisition community. We examine conflict across all warfighting domains to assess foreign capabilities and understand our adversaries' intent. DIA's dedicated professionals, in partnership with our intelligence community colleagues, allies, and foreign partners, deliver timely and relevant intelligence on threats and challenges facing our nation. DIA has a highly resilient workforce that has overcome difficult challenges posed by the pandemic. Today, my goal is to convey DIA's insights to you and the American public on the evolving threat environment as we understand it. As I look at the global landscape today, I want to begin with Russia and its invasion of Ukraine, which is now in its third month. Russian military capabilities have been used to violate the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, and they pose an existential threat to U.S. national security and that of our allies. The invasion has demonstrated Russia's intent to overturn the U.S.-led, rules-based, post-Cold War international order, expand its control over the former Soviet Union, and reclaim what it regards as its rightful position on the world stage. Moscow's underestimation of Ukraine's effective resistance, Russia's substantial battlefield losses, and Western resolve to support Ukraine has undermined Moscow's assault on Kyiv and improved prospects that Ukraine can successfully defend its sovereignty. Moscow has now shifted its focus to eastern Ukraine, where it appears to be prioritizing defeating Ukrainian forces in the Donbass. In response to stiff resistance, Russia has resorted to more indiscriminate and brutal methods that are destroying cities, infrastructure, and increasing civilian deaths. Negotiations remain stalled as both sides focus on the outcome of the battle in the Donbass, while partnership with Ukraine and warning of potential escalation remain key priorities for DIA. Turning to China, it remains a pacing threat and major security challenge. Beijing has long viewed the United States as a strategic competitor. China is capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. The PLA, which has already fielded sophisticated weapons and instituted major organizational reforms to enhance joint operations, is nearing the status of global competitor to the United States, its allies, and partners, and is a credible peer competitor in the region. China's current nuclear force expansion is historic. The United States faces military and intelligence threats from competitors, particularly Russia and China, who have and are developing new capabilities intended to contest, limit, or exceed U.S. military advantage. State and non-state actors are selectively putting these capabilities into play globally and regionally. These capabilities also span all warfighting domains: maritime, land, air, electronic warfare, cyberspace, information, and space. They include more lethal ballistic and cruise missiles, growing nuclear stockpiles, modernized conventional forces, and a range of gray zone measures, such as the use of ambiguous unconventional forces, foreign proxies, information manipulation, cyber attacks, and economic coercion. Strategic competitors and other challenges are exerting increasing military pressure on neighboring states. Russia has invaded Ukraine. China is threatening Taiwan, and Iran, through its proxies, threatens neighbors in the Middle East and U.S. forces, while also enriching uranium to new levels. North Korea continues to threaten South Korea, Japan, and the United States with nuclear-capable ballistic missiles of increased range and lethality. Transnationally, the terrorist threat will also persist, and we need to understand more about the lessons learned from our experience supporting military and intelligence operations in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Turning back to my own organization, I take the health, safety, and well-being of my workforce very, very seriously. DIA remains actively engaged in investigating anomalous health incidents, AHIs. My agency has the process and procedures in place to quickly respond to reports from employees or their families who believe that they have been impacted by AHI. We're also partnering with other members of the IIC to determine the origin and cause of the reported events. I am honored to lead DIA. My intent in this hearing is that this helps Congress and our nation better understand the threats and challenges we face from foreign adversaries and competitors. I look forward to your questions, and thank you for your continued support.
Thank you, General. Let me remind my colleagues that at the conclusion of this open session, there will be a classified session at SVC 217, and the witnesses may defer some responses to that classified session. Director Haines, your description of the unfolding battle in the Ukraine suggests that it's moving to a battle of attrition over a long term, and that the objectives of the Russians are to destroy the Ukrainian forces and also disrupt the international coalition through economic pressures, gasoline prices, and other factors we're witnessing. That leads us to, at least to me, to the question of how effective are our economic sanctions, and what more can we do to bring pressure to the people of Russia so that they are less supportive of this effort.
Thank you, Chairman. I think from our perspective, the economic sanctions and the export controls have had a pretty significant impact on Russia. And among the indicators that one might look at are, for example, the fact that we're seeing close to about, we predict approximately 20% inflation, in Russia, that we expect that their GDP will fall about 10%, possibly even more, over the course of the year. We've seen not only the sanctions enacted by the United States and Europe and other partners around the world having these impacts, but also the private sector taking action on its own to remove itself. So things like the fact that oil production services and companies pulled themselves out will have an impact on Russia's capacity to produce, and that's a major revenue source, obviously, for Russia. We've seen other indicators of essentially the private sector impact in these areas. And on the export controls, we're seeing how things like export controls on semiconductors and so on are affecting their defense industry. So I think that's a very significant impact, essentially, although obviously time will tell as we move forward.
Are you sensing that any popular unease, perhaps, in terms of these economic factors that could translate into a political resistance to the regime?
Well, I know many of us saw the protests that erupted after the invasion, and then the crackdown that occurred essentially in Russia, including passing laws that would provide for very significant punishments in the event that one protested on these issues. And so we've seen those reduce, actually, and when we've looked at effectively, polling and so on that indicates where it is that the Russian people are, what we see is that the majority of the Russian people continue to support the special military operation. And I think it's just very hard, frankly, for information to get into Russia to the Russian people. They have a very particular perspective that they're being fed by the government during this period.
Thank you. General Berrier, what do you believe the Chinese are taking away from their close scrutiny of the Russian activities in Crimea, and not Crimea, but Ukraine, excuse me?
Senator, I think the Chinese are going to watch this very, very carefully. It's going to take some time for them to sort out all elements of diplomatic, information, military, economic that has occurred with this crisis. I think they're thinking about future operations probably against Taiwan and how difficult that might be. They're probably also thinking about the scrutiny that they would come under should they entertain thoughts or operations like that.
Thank you. And final question, Director Haines. Do you, I think you indicated in your testimony that cyber interference in our elections is a distinct possibility. Is that something that your agency or the agencies are following and taking preemptive steps?
Yes, absolutely, Senator. We are well positioned to essentially monitor for the potential of election influence, and including efforts through cyber.
Now, one other final question is that are you surprised that the Russians have not used cyber attacks against third parties or against the United States directly up to this point? I think that was a concern we all had from the beginning of this operation.
Yeah, I think what we've seen is the Russians have obviously attacked Ukraine, and we've attributed a variety of attacks to them in that context, including, for example, destructive wiper attacks against Ukrainian government websites, DDoS attacks against their financial industry. They also were engaged in attacks intended to get at command and control communications in Ukraine during the invasion. That attack had an outsized impact. In other words, we assessed that they intended to focus in on Ukrainian command and control, but ultimately they ended up affecting a much broader set of VSATs, essentially of very small terminals outside of Ukraine, including in Europe, and yet we have not seen the level of attacks, to your point, that we expected, and we have a variety of different sort of theories for why that might be the case, including the fact that we think that they may have determined that the collateral impact of such attacks would be challenging for them in the context of Ukraine. Also, that they may not have wished to essentially sacrifice potential access and collection opportunities in those scenarios. And then in terms of attacks against the United States, I think they have had a longstanding concern about the potential for escalation in cyber vis-a-vis the United States. That doesn't mean that they won't attack at some point, but it has been interesting to see that they haven't during this period.
Thank you very much. Senator Inhofe, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For both of you, the lack of an independent intelligence community significantly worsened Putin's decision-making in Ukraine. What do you think President Xi in China is learning about his intelligence communities, both of you?
Thank you. Senator Inhofe, I think it's a really interesting question. I'd prefer to answer it perhaps in closed session. Would that be all right, sir?
That's fine. How about you? Any comments to make in this open session?
Senator, I will take the DNI's lead on that.
I suspected that. Thank you. The Biden administration has offered Iran significant sanctions relief in return to the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. General Berrier, would you expect Iran to spend at least some of this sanctions relief on its terrorist proxies and missile programs? Do you agree that if the IRGC has additional money that they would increase their targeting of Americans and our allies, or let's say, could they increase that targeting?
Yes, Senator, they could increase targeting against our partners in the region as well as U.S. forces if they had increased funding.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. Let me recognize Senator Shaheen, please.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you both for your testimony this morning. I returned a couple of weeks ago from the Western Balkans with Senator Tillis and Senator Murphy. We visited Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. And one of the things we heard in that region was a great deal of concern about Russian meddling and the potential, particularly in Bosnia, for that to further destabilize the country. Are you all following what's going on in that part of Europe, and are you equally concerned?
Should I start? Thank you, Senator Shaheen. So I'll just start and obviously hand over to my colleague as well. But yes, we are concerned about this. This is something we've been working with NATO on in particular to try to help them be more resilient in this context. And, you know, both information and cyber issues are obviously at stake. But I think managing how it is that Russia develops and what kind of activities they engage in worldwide during this crisis and beyond will be a critical aspect of our work moving forward.
Can I just, before you begin, General, can I just ask you to speak to NATO and U4 in Bosnia? Because as you know, the authorization for U4 is going to end this fall in Bosnia, and there's real concern about Russia's willingness to allow that to continue. So what are we doing to ensure that the troops are not taken out of Bosnia and a void left that provides a real vacuum for instability?
Senator, I think that's a policy question. I would refer it to the Department of Defense. And Senator, to the earlier portion of your question, I believe this is a key component of strategic competition, and this is where I think with our partners and allies and certainly NATO, we have to be able to identify that kind of malign activity and expose it and help our partners and future partners be aware of it and do more to counter it. Yes, we are aware of it.
Thank you. Well, I would say that policy decision needs to be viewed very closely by everybody so that we don't wind up with a vacuum there that we're not able to address. I want to go to what's still happening with ISIS because, as you both know, we have thousands of ISIS family members who are still being held in camps in northern Syria. They're posing a persistent challenge, not only humanitarian, but the potential as breeding grounds for terrorists. So are we watching closely what's going on there, and what are we doing to try and address what's happening in those camps?
From the perspective of the Department of Defense and DI, we are watching very, very closely what's happening in those camps, what's happened since the break-in, and really with our CENTCOM partners, trying to monitor ISIS capability as it evolves over time and what's happening with those families and where they're moving. This is a problem that we partner with CENTCOM and the Defense Counterterrorism Center and really the National Counterterrorism Center. It's a huge focus for everybody.
And do we have a strategy for how to deal with it?
We have an intelligence collection strategy to monitor it.
And we're seeing the Taliban in Afghanistan renege on everything they said they would do post troop withdrawal. Obviously, one of those is continuing their relationship with al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups in Afghanistan. How concerned are you that we might see terrorist activity spread out of Afghanistan to the rest of the world?
Senator, I am more concerned about ISIS-K in Afghanistan and the fact that they have had some successful and catastrophic attacks within Afghanistan, which does not portend well for the future. Al-Qaeda has had some problems with reconstitution leadership, and to a degree, I think the Taliban have held to their word about not allowing al-Qaeda to rejuvenate it so far, but it's something that we watch very, very carefully.
And there was an election in the Philippines yesterday, and the winner of that election, Mr. Marcos, is not likely to have as positive a view to the United States. Are you concerned that that is going to have an impact on how China is going to view activity in the Philippines? And do we expect there might be any spillover in terms of illegal substances from the Philippines now that Duterte is no longer doing his extra legal killing of people suspected of being drug kingpins?
Senator, I think it's early in the process with the elected Marcos to determine whether or not he'll be anti-U.S. or pro-U.S. I know that we would like to have the Philippines as a key intelligence partner in the region. I think there's a lot of effort going on to do that. So we'll wait to see what percolates of all this in our relationship, and I'll just end it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sheen. Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel today. Last week in the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, Undersecretary of Research and Engineering Heidi Shue stated, quote, "Strategic competitors of the United States are rapidly developing their nuclear arsenal in new and novel ways with a clear intent of increasing their reliance on these weapons in their security strategies," end quote. Director Haines, do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
General, do you?
Yes.
Throughout the war in Ukraine, Putin and other Russian leaders have overtly threatened nuclear use, including Russian state TV airing an animated video showing the British Isles being completely destroyed by a nuclear attack. General, in the United States, we view nuclear weapons primarily as tools of deterrence. But do you think that what we're seeing indicates Russian leadership views nuclear weapons as tools of coercion and intimidation?
Yes, I believe they view those as tools of coercion and intimidation.
Thank you. General, also the Defense Intelligence Agency's 2021 report on China's military power states, quote, "The accelerating pace of the PRC's nuclear expansion may enable the PRC to have up to 700 deliverable nuclear warheads by 2027. The PRC likely intends to have at least 1,000 warheads by 2030, exceeding the pace and size the DoD projected in 2020, end quote. I know what you say is limited in this setting, but is it your assessment that China's nuclear forces will stop expanding when it reaches that point of 1,000?
It is my assessment that they would continue to develop the weapons they have.
Director Haines, is that view shared by the rest of the IC? That China's arsenal is going to continue to grow past that point in time?
I mean, our assessment basically says that China will continue to essentially expand their nuclear arsenal and diversification for a period of time. It's unclear how long that will be.
But you anticipate it will continue past the 1,000 warheads that we have looked at in the past?
I think for us to get into numbers, we should do that in closed session.
Okay, thank you. General, as the statement notes, China's nuclear expansion is larger and more rapid than previous assessments projected. Admiral Richard has made a similar point, noting, quote, "When I first testified here, we were questioning whether or not China would be able to double that stockpile by the end of the decade, and they are actually very close to doing it on my watch," end quote. What are the implications of the fact that this threat is evolving faster than we've anticipated, and how should we factor that in our assessments?
Senator, we can get into much more detail in the closed session, but I would just say from a strategic competition perspective and nuclear deterrence, this makes it much more challenging for us to defend. And when you factor in Russian nuclear capability with Chinese capability, I think it's a problem for Strategic Command and the department.
Thank you. Also, General, if we can move to a different theater now, if ISIS and al-Qaeda are able to operate in Afghanistan without consistent or effective CT pressure, how long does the intelligence community assess it will take for either organization to reconstitute their external attack capabilities?
We assess ISIS probably a year, slightly longer, and longer for al-Qaeda.
You know, last October we heard from Secretary Call. He told the committee that we could see ISIS-K generate the capability in 6 to 12 months. And then in March we heard from General McKenzie that the capability might be 12 to 18 months. So I look forward to hearing more about how and why these intelligence estimates have shifted forward. I think that's important for this committee to know, and it's important to understand when we look at the dramatic reduction we've seen in our intelligence collection in the region since our withdrawal. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Gillibrand, please.
Director Haines, thank you so much for your testimony. I want to talk a little bit about advanced persistent threats, and I want to know what type of support are you providing critical infrastructure providers to deal with APTs? Specifically, I'm concerned if this war in Ukraine does escalate, that attacks from Russia will come to American businesses and our critical infrastructure. I know this is generally the job of CISA, but in your engagement with critical infrastructure providers, what are the biggest areas of need that they have shared with you? And are there any additional authorities that would be helpful to you in enabling you to support critical infrastructure providers in securing their networks?
Thank you, Senator. And I know this has been a major issue of focus for you, and in fact that you've supported some of the things that have been done in New York with reserves, for example, in this area, which have been really effective. And I know that General Nakasone has been looking at expanding that and as around the United States in different ways. I think for us, look, we have quite obviously heightened awareness of cyber threats to critical infrastructure, and it's been a driving force behind a number of sort of cyber defense measures that we've taken in the intelligence community to support, in effect, as you say, CISA and FBI and others in doing their work. One is lowering thresholds for reporting. We've asked for network owners to really lower their threshold for reporting suspected malicious activity. That's critical from our perspective in order for us to be able to identify what the threat is. Another is just making more information publicly available. We're increasing the amount of information that we release to the private sector, both to help combat the rise in cybercrime and recently in our efforts to posture industry for potential Russian cyber attacks, for example, something that we've been trying to get out to do significantly more briefings on and help industry, in effect, get ready for things so they can take action that would make them more resilient in these circumstances. And this includes some close hold releases, so as to dampen malicious cyber actors' warning before mitigations can be put into place. Another has been our significant outreach to the private sector. DHS partners held over 90 engagements with more than 10,000 partners, just even on the Russia piece. And it includes sharing preventative measures to help these partners mitigate vulnerabilities. Another has been facilitating hunt teams on networks. And we've also asked company owners to actively hunt for Russian techniques, essentially, on their networks, and to facilitate this, have provided lists of vulnerabilities, indicators of compromise to look for on a company's networks. But those are just some of the things that are focused on helping on the infrastructure piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Do you need any additional authorities or resources to amplify this effort?
So we've asked for resources in our FY23 budget that are designed to help with this effort, and so absolutely in that sense. We haven't identified particular authorities that we need, but I will tell you that we will come to you if we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Haines and General Berrier, I saw that the annual threat assessment notes that advances in dual-use technology could, quote, enable development of novel biological weapons that complicate detection, attribution, and treatment, end of quote. I've advocated for a One Health security approach where we incorporate people across multiple disciplines, including the intelligence community, to increase our biodefense and prevent the next pandemic. In the context of ongoing biological threats, how would you suggest we develop a multidisciplinary approach like this? Where can we prepare and prevent both naturally occurring diseases but also deliberate threats?
I can start on this. I'm very passionate about this issue. I completely agree with you. I think we have not in the intelligence community sort of been able to work with other parts of, for example, the federal government, even in the scientific community within the federal government, as effectively as we need to. And we have been developing mechanisms in the intelligence community to do so more. We're working more with the national labs than we ever have before. We're working more with HHS, with CDC, with others, to try to make sure that we're also supporting their work and that we can understand some of the issues that they see as critical our work. And so that's been a big piece of our effort in the intelligence community within the National Counterproliferation and Center. We have been doing a major effort on essentially working with global health, and we actually now have a new national intelligence manager that works on these issues specifically and is hoping to support that kind of outreach on this, and be happy to give you a brief at some point in more detail if that's useful.
Thank you.
Senator, for DI, I think it's about partnerships. So it's a partnership between the National Center for Medical Intelligence, the Defense Counterproliferation Center, as well as NCPC. The role really for DI and NCMI is to provide warning on these pandemics. So I'm passionate about it as well, and I think it's an area that's going to expand in the coming months and years as we look forward to this. And I look forward to engaging you, perhaps at DI, on this topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Cotton, please.
General, what's your assessment on the state of the fighting between Russia and Ukraine and eastern and southern Ukraine today?
Senator, I think I would characterize it as the Russians aren't winning and the Ukrainians aren't winning, and we're at a bit of a stalemate here. And what has been the most interesting evolution for me in watching how the Russian forces have misstepped is really the lack of a non-commissioned officer corps. When I think about small unit tactics and how this is unfolded between Ukraine and Russia, I think the NCO Corps is a big piece of this, and I think the Ukrainians have that about right.
Who faces greater risk from a stalemate, Russia or Ukraine?
I think we have to take a wait and see approach on how this evolves and what is in the decision calculus for Putin and his generals as this unfolds.
And a stalemate, to be clear, does not mean an armistice or peace. It means continued but indecisive fighting in which both sides are losing personnel, equipment, weapons, and vehicles, right?
I think it's attrition warfare, and it depends. It depends how well the Ukrainians can maintain what they have going on with weapons and ammunition, and how the Russians decide to deal with that, either through mobilization or not, and decide to go with what they have in the theater right now.
Which side do you think at this point is more capable of generating additional combat power in the form of trained and motivated troops, Russia or Ukraine?
Ukraine.
Even though it's 1/3 the size of Russia?
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Because I think the Ukrainians have it right in terms of grit and how they face the defense of their nation. I'm not sure that Russian soldiers from the far-flung military districts really understand that.
Fighting to defend one's own home from a war of aggression is a highly motivating factor, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And Russians probably are not terribly motivated to be the next wave of recruits into Vladimir Putin's war of aggression?
I would say not, based on what we've seen.
If that's the case, and this stalemate, as you call it, continues not just for weeks but for months, which side do you think faces the greater possibility of a decisive breakout? The Russians with their ill-trained and unmotivated troops, or the Ukrainians with their supremely motivated troops?
Senator, I think right now with the stalemate as it stands, if Russia doesn't declare war and mobilize, this stalemate's going to last for a while, and I don't see a breakout on either side. If they do mobilize and they do declare war, that'll bring thousands of more soldiers to the fight, and even though they may not be as well trained and competent, they will still bring mass and a lot more ammunition.
What are the prospects of a catastrophic collapse of morale and will among Russian forces?
Remains to be seen. I think the Russians still are a learning organization. If appropriate lessons could be applied with leadership, you might see that turn around.
Do you know the current count on how many generals have been killed in Ukraine on Russia's side?
I think the number is between 8 and 10.
You know how many generals we lost in 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Not many.
And those we lost were happenstance, right? The bad guys got a lucky shot at a convoy or a helicopter?
Yes.
Does the fact that Russia is losing all these generals, and as you pointed out, they have no trained NCO corps, suggest to you that these generals are having to go forward to ensure their orders are executed in a way that General Berrier never would have to go forward if he was in a combat command, because he could count on the captains and the lieutenants and the sergeant Berriers to execute his orders?
Yes.
Sounds to me like the balance of forces here are moving more decisively in Ukraine's factor and will continue to over time as long as we continue to support them with the arms and the intelligence that they need. Thank you.
Well-led forces that are motivated and have what they need can do a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Blumenthal, please.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pursue Senator Cotton's line of questioning, if I may. In my exchange with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff several weeks ago, I commented that our approach to Ukraine seems somewhat schizophrenic. We say we want Ukraine to win, but we're afraid of what Putin may do if he loses. I have urged since 2014 that we provide more lethal weapons to Ukraine. When I visited Ukraine recently with some of my colleagues, a bipartisan trip, one of them asked President Zelensky, are you fearful about the Russian prospect of invasion? It was a number of weeks before the invasion. He said, the Russians invaded us in 2014. We have been fighting them since then. And in my view, the implication is that we have failed over a period of years under different administrations to provide Ukraine with the arms that it needs to counter and deter increased Russian aggression there. So my question to you is, do you agree that we should increase the kind of military aid, as well as humanitarian assistance and economic sanctions, that we've been providing by orders of magnitude that will enable Ukraine to win? And would you also agree that if we simply provide more of that kind of aid, tanks, artillery, armed personnel carriers, even planes, Stinger and Javelin missiles, all of the arms that Ukraine needs to fight lethally and defensively, that Putin may engage in sword rattling and threats and implications of what he might do, but enabling Ukraine to win ought to be our objective. Let me ask you first, General.
Senator, in your statement there, it really gets at national level decision making on what our policy should be with regard to arming Ukraine. My role as the director of DIA is to keep an eye on this conflict and provide information to decision makers so that they can make those kinds of decisions. In terms of what Putin might do to escalate, I think the best that we can do, rather than describing what those escalatory measures would be to understand what they might do and be ready in terms of indications and warning to be able to notify decision makers that that was actually occurring or about to occur. So I take an intelligence perspective of the conflict itself and leave the policy to decision makers.
Do you, and I'll ask Ms. Haines the same, think there is a serious immediate prospect that Putin would engage in the use of tactical nuclear weapons?
Right now, we do not see that, and I think that's a huge warning issue for us and something that we're very, very focused on.
Ms. Haines?
Thank you, Senator. I think on the first part of your question, as General Berrier said, obviously we try to provide the intelligence to help policymakers like you make these decisions. And among the questions that come up in that discussion are whether or not, frankly, Ukraine can absorb additional assistance and how much of it. And that's very hard for us to tell. We have, in fact, more insight probably on the Russian side than we do on the Ukrainian side. But that's something, obviously, for the Defense Department to work through, essentially, as they go through this. But we also, obviously, get asked this question of whether or not certain actions will escalate things with Russia, as you indicate, and if so, how? And that really gets to the second part of your question, because I think, obviously, we're in a position, as you've identified, where we're supporting Ukraine, but we also don't want to ultimately end up in World War III, and we don't want to have a situation in which actors are using nuclear weapons. Our view is, as General Berrier indicated, that there is not a sort of an imminent potential for Putin to use nuclear weapons. We perceive that, as I indicated in my statement, as something that he is unlikely to do unless there is effectively an existential threat to his regime and to Russia from his perspective. We do think that that could be the case in the event that he perceives that he is losing the war in Ukraine, and that NATO, in effect, is sort of either intervening or about to intervene in that context, which would obviously contribute to a perception that he is about to lose the war in Ukraine. But that there are a lot of things that he would do in the context of escalation before he would get to a nuclear weapon, and also that he would be likely to engage in some signaling beyond what he's done thus far before doing so.
Thank you. My time has expired.
On behalf of the chairman, Senator Blackburn.